International. You are listening to our one-hour broadcast in English for listeners in Western Europe and Africa. We can also be heard on the internet at www.ri.ro, Channel 1. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and other social media platforms. Our programs are also available on TuneIn, Radio Romania International 1, and in Europe via satellite UTC 16A on 11,512 MHz, vertical polarization, azimuth 16 degrees east. We wish you good reception conditions.
Hello, I'm your host Elena Enake, bringing you the news. But first, let's take a quick look at the weather picture. Maximum temperatures across the country range from 1 to 12 degrees Celsius. The noon reading in Bucharest was 4 degrees. And now the news, the headlines. Trade unionists in Romania continue their protests against the government's salary policies. The Romanian state ended 2023 with a budget deficit of 5.68% of the GDP. And Romania is ranked as the 63rd least corrupt country out of 108 according to Transparency International's annual corruption perception index. In Romania, employees of hundreds of town halls in the rural area are on a warning strike today. Their main dissatisfaction is related to salaries. According to the trade unions in the field, almost 11,000 employees from over 800 town halls in the country signed for the protests. Trade unionists threaten with an all-out strike starting on February 5th. On the other hand, on Tuesday, trade unions in the healthcare sector announced that there are continuing protests as they say the current salary offer of the government in Bucharest is not what they expected. Romania ended 2023 with a budget deficit of 5.68% of the GDP. A level of 4.4% had been initially forecast when the state budget for last year was drawn up. The deficit is, however, below the 6.3% estimated by the European Commission in its forecast. Data from the Finance Ministry showed that the difference between revenues and expenditure was almost 18 billion euros. With 46 points out of 100, Romania continues to be one of the EU countries with the poorest results in the implementation of anti-corruption measures, according to Transparency International's annual Corruption Perceptions Index. The organization's recommendations for Romania include updating the legislation in the field of public integrity, improving organizational and decision-making transparency, standardizing and clarifying administrative procedures. The Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan is on a visit to Bucharest for a meeting with his Romanian counterpart Luminița Odobescu. The Turkish official will also have talks with Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu and Senate Speaker Nicolae Ciucă. According to the Turkish media, Hakan Fidan is meeting with his counterparts to discuss bilateral relations as well as current regional and global developments. The relations between Romania and Turkey take place within the framework of the strategic partnership signed by the two countries in 2011 at the level of presidency, followed by a joint action plan signed in 2013 by the foreign ministers. Romanian President Klaus Iohannis is in Brussels to participate in a ceremony staged by the European Commission in memory of Jacques Delors, a former European Commission president between 1985 and 1995, and to attend on Thursday the extraordinary meeting of the European Council. The Council meeting will focus on reaching an agreement on the main elements of the proposed revision of the multi-annual financial framework 2021-2027. The most important decisions are the support for Ukraine, including military support through the European Peace Facility, in keeping with that country's needs, Klaus Johannes will firmly plead for Ukraine to remain a top priority on the European Union agenda. The Constitutional Court of Romania is debating today the notification of the High Court of Cassation and Justice in relation to the so-called fugitive law. In the opinion of the Supreme Court, among the citizen rights violated by this law are the right to a fair trial and the right to individual freedom. The plenary session of the Chamber of Deputies adopted in November 2023 a draft law initiated by the Ministry of Justice, which stipulates that people who receive a final sentence and who do not report to the police within 7 days to be incarcerated will be considered escaped and risk a punishment between 6 months and 3 years. The penalty applied for the crime of escape is added to the penalty remaining unexecuted on the date of escape, the law also says. And that was the news coming to you from Bucharest, Radio Romania International.
The Romanian government is doing the final math for the year 2023. I'm Mihaela Ignatescu with more in this report by Roxana Vasile. The coalition government in Bucharest is making final calculations for 2023. Higher expenses generated a deficit of around 90 billion lei, which is the equivalent of 18 billion euros, accounting for 5.68% of the gross domestic product. The deficit is slightly lower as a percentage of the GDP compared to the one recorded in 2022, but it is more than 1 percentage point above the figure considered when building the budget. At the beginning of last year, the executive set out with a target of 4.4%, which is 70 billion lei. However, while the revenues were somewhat in line with the graph, the budget slippage in the spending chapter accounted for some 20 billion lei. According to the Ministry of Finance, revenues stood at over 521 billion lei, up by 13%. The dynamics were mainly supported by the money coming from European funds, salary and income tax and insurance contributions. As a percentage of the GDP, revenue stood at 32.9%. On the other hand, spending exceeded 611 billion lei, and as a percentage of the GDP, they maintained at the level of 38.6% as in 2022. Diarul Financiar notes the fact that according to the figures for 11 months, the budget deficit was 4.64% of the GDP, which would mean that the government deepened it at the end of 2023 in December. Be that as it may, the first topic on the agenda of the discussions these days between the Romanian authorities and a delegation of the International Monetary Fund is precisely about the budget deficit. Romania has pledged to gradually reduce it to 3%, the limit stipulated by the European treaties. Although it is far from this target, the good news is that the deficit of 5.68% in 2023 is still below that anticipated by the European Commission in its autumn forecast, which was 6.3%, but also beyond the expectations of many analysts who believe it would be 6%. Let's remember that Romania has been under an excessive deficit procedure since 2020, when it set out to return to less than 3% in 2024. However, the pandemic and the war neighboring Ukraine followed. As a result, Bucharest was forced to negotiate with the European Commission for 2023 a target between 5.5 and 5.7% of the GDP. For 2024, the country's budget is built on an anticipated deficit of 5%. Meanwhile, in order to keep it under control, the government has already taken a series of unpopular measures. Tax increases have come into force or new ones have been introduced, and vouchers and bonuses have been frozen. The unions warned in the fall of last year that protests would follow, and this is indeed happening right now. Romania continues to be one of the EU countries with poor results in fighting corruption. I'm Roxana Vasile with details in this commentary by Ștefan Stoica. Corruption Perceptions Index reflects how independent and business experts perceive corruption in the public sector in 180 states and territories. In a ranking drawn up by Transparency International, by awarding points from 0 to 100, 0 means very corrupt and 100 not corrupt at all. The continental and world champions are three Nordic states, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, joined by New Zealand. Romania is ranked only on the 63rd position, the same as last year. With 46 points, Romania is still among the EU countries with the poorest results regarding the implementation of anti-corruption measures, which reflects significant deficiencies regarding the rule of law. Romania's neighbors in the ranking and also geographically, Bulgaria has 45 points and Hungary 42 points, being at the bottom of the ranking in terms of integrity. According to Transparency International, most states have made no progress at all or have made minimal progress in combating corruption in the public sector. It's essential to have independent, transparent and resourceful legal authorities and institutions able to keep corruption under control, the organization believes. In many countries, including Romania, there is still a big gap between the provisions of the laws and the way in which they are implemented, Transparency International noted. Therefore, constant actions and measures are necessary to ensure both the improvement of anti-corruption mechanisms and the strengthening of integrity. For Romania, Transparency International's recommendations include updating the legislation in the field of public integrity to bridge the gaps and correct legislative inconsistencies and improve the clarity of regulation in this area. The organization also recommends improving organizational and decision-making transparency, including through effective public consultations and easy access to information of public interest, the standardization and clarification of administrative procedures by adopting the Code of Administrative Procedure. Also, in the case of Romania, it would be necessary to adopt legislation that should clarify the status, career, and efficiency of public administration employees, as well as the use of integrity pacts as a monitoring tool for public procurement, especially for procurement procedures and contracts with high risks for the occurrence of irregularities, integrity incidents, or fraud. Transparency International reiterates the fact that there is a need for a constant involvement by representatives of society, from the political class and institutions to the public environment and citizens, each having their own role and responsibility in strengthening public integrity. Transparency International recalls that it contributed to the establishment or consolidation of institutions with a major role in combating corruption and developed and implemented ethics and integrity standards for the public sector and the business environment. And that was Radio Newsview.